Professor Mario Molina, who is the Nobel Prize Laureate in Chemistry from 1995. We have Professor Peter Grünberg, who was the Nobel Laureate in Physics in 2007. We have Professor Peter Agre, who was the Nobel Laureate in Chemistry in 2003. We have Professor Murray Gell-Mann, who was the Nobel Laureate in Physics in 1969. We have Professor Catherine Richardson, who is a professor in biological oceanography from the University of Copenhagen, where you also are Vice Dean. We have Professor Will Steffen, who is the Executive Director at the Australian National University Climate Change Institute. And we have Ms. Sunita Narayan, who is the Director General, Center for Science and Environment in India. We have asked the panelists to, or we have given them the opportunity for a 2-minute sort of opening remark with some of the key points, and of course, linking up to the theme of the panel. Science is speaking. We have heard that now. And many of you have been speaking for quite some time about global challenges. Is anyone really listening? And I would like to start off with you, Professor Molina. Please send questions, by the way. You're working hard. Are there any questions coming? Good. Professor Molina, you were one of the scientists discovering the ozone hole. Obviously, that was a good example where science was speaking, and actually a lot of people were listening very, very rapidly. What is your perspective on this now, when we are moving in and trying to get new issues also on the agenda? Please.
Well, we were very successful with the stratospheric ozone issue. People did listen, and we do have an international agreement, the Montreal Protocol, that essentially solves the problem. But with the current situation, sustainability and particularly climate change, we scientists are speaking, but not in a very clear language, I'm afraid. So we haven't done a very good job. So the main message I would try to convey to society is that the basic science of understanding how the climate works, how the planet works, is very well established. It's not in question. We have some very big names, scientists like Svante Arrhenius, Einstein, Planck, Maxwell, and so on, that we have a basic understanding of all this science, not in question, and yet it's misunderstood. In many places, not here in Scandinavia, or perhaps the United States, there is a suspicion that it's only something we scientists are cooking up. But that's not the case. It's very clear, and it's not all that complicated. It's at elementary university level, perhaps even below. The complication is that the system is complex, so the details are complicated, and we cannot quantify precisely how much will the climate change if we continue business as usual. But we are sure of one thing, and that's what we want to communicate. It's very clear that we can make the point that the risk is very significant of some very large impacts happening if we don't change. That's why our message here is it's very important to change. We're not sure what will happen, but the risk, nevertheless, is extremely clear. We haven't heard any convincing arguments that we hear from politicians sometimes that this is not the problem. There are no convincing arguments that the risk is negligible. Nobody has made that case. So that's our main message. Given that the fact that the risk is important, then as individuals, no longer as scientists, given that risk, we think we have to push society because of values, future generations. We have to start doing something.
But just a quick follow-up. The ozone issue. What was it that made that really trigger action so quickly? Was it because it was so obvious that you could really see the effects in parts, in particular parts of the southern hemisphere?
Well, it was difficult at the very beginning. It wasn't obvious. I remember talking to the press, and they were so, oh, you're talking about some invisible gases protecting us from invisible radiation that are doing some harm to people. So yeah, we had to explain. But the science became very clear, and we were able to work with decision makers, ambassadors, and with industry. And we convinced them that the science was so clear we had to change, and society was going to end up winning. They were worried about economic losses and so on. That did not materialize. So we succeeded, and more than 190 nations, they all signed and ratified these international agreements. And essentially the problem is now solved, except these compounds remain for many decades in the atmosphere. So we have to wait until the atmosphere heals itself, but we are no longer emitting these gases.
Oh, and of course, you make an important point. It was quite easy to find other substances without any great economic loss. And of course, climate change relates to our whole energy systems, which may be more complicated.
But there's a very important point there that we stress here in this talk. Yes, it's not going to be easy. It might be expensive, maybe 1–2% of global GDP,
yes.
But very clearly it will cost less than the impact. Very much less. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Grünberg, what makes people really listen? I mean, you come from a science, physics, which is actually quite often complicated, we find, being laypersons. You know, it's very, very complex and so on. Yeah. What makes people really listen to scientists? What do we need to really consider?
I think physicists, scientists, should make their effects on which they work as transparent as possible. And I think then there is not the real problem.
But what do you mean when you say that they have to make their work transparent as possible? Is that taking a step further? Because of course in science still, publication in scientific journals, that's what counts. Yeah. But for science to be more transparent, do you mean that they have to be more proactive in media? They have to write and be engaged in other arenas than just science?
Of course, there is a whole profession of people who write in understandable journals about science and Scientific American and what you have. So I would say it's also their task to do this and make transparent what the scientists find out.
Thank you very much. And I think that's another key point. I mean, transparency is very interesting to get from a scientist also. We quite often push for transparency in politics and so, but science is, of course, sometimes maybe quite a closed group, and you need to be able to see what is actually happening there, and that should be in the interest of science as well. If I could move to Professor Agre then, you are working you are a chemist, but you work in public health. And of course, quite often we can see that when there is an issue of public health, take the swine flu or whatever is going on, you get an extraordinary action from globally. I mean, you really get politicians to take actions. And in Sweden, we are even debating maybe they took too much action. You know, they wanted to put needles in all of us and give us all vaccines and so on. What can we learn from that, from this sector?
Well, I think the topic of this discussion is anybody listening? And I think the public is listening. And from my point of view, perhaps the most important bullet point in the memorandum is number 8, establishing a new contract between science and society. Because I think Mario Molino is a good example of establishing scientific principles which have obvious conclusions, but they didn't leave it at that level. They communicated this with the public. And that's where the challenge is. Because oftentimes, I think the public has a bit of fear that the science is beyond what they can understand. And I had a wonderful professor when I was a medical student. I'm actually not a chemist, I'm a medical doctor. His name was Daniel Nathans. He won the Nobel Prize. And the journalists rushed in to interview him. He discovered the enzymes that, with Arbour and Smith that cut DNA. He started explaining, and they interrupted him and said, no, we're not scientists, we'll not understand. And Dr. Nathan said something very important. He said, no, listen. In science, the details are complex, but the principles are elegant and simple, and he proceeded to explain. So I think, in part, it's our job to do this. And I think the press is interested, I think the public is interested, and I'm optimistic.
Maybe I'll also just ask a follow-up question, and when you become more transparent, as you say, I mean, you as a scientist, you expose yourself also. When you try to get into politics, I mean, you interact with civil society, or you reach out outside your own circles. There is quite a high risk, of course, of being much more criticized also, because out there it's not always science, it's also politics or ideology and culture, etc., etc. Do you think that this refrains some scientists from taking that step out because they don't want to be exposed?
I think there are reasons people don't go into political life, and part of it is the difficulty raising funds, particularly in the United States, and the potential for embarrassment. But any of us who have raised children understand that they can point out what we do which is foolish, and these minor embarrassments are not an issue. I think the importance of science is so large that it should not be the issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Gellman, also, of course, in physics, quarks, which is everyday word today, you know, I'm sure. But you wrote a book also called Quark and the Jaguar, which is about simplicity and complexity, which I think is a little bit what we have talked about. You know, there is simplicity, there are simple parts, but there are also complexity. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective? Because you have obviously worked quite a lot on this particular challenge.
Well, one thing that's striking about our era is precisely the complexity of the issues that we are up against. There's so many different things to worry about. And it's much easier in life to have one or two things that you're concerned about and try to fix them. But if you look at all these issues, they really proliferate. Many people at this meeting were particularly concerned, as you know, with climate change as a result of emission of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. But think of all the other things that are going on. Photochemical smog, that's something else that results from pumping things into the atmosphere. Nutrition problems, serious nutrition problems, diets that are unhealthy, forests that are disappearing, or if they're not disappearing, they have important components of the ecological system being eliminated or reduced. Even parrots, especially macaws, being trapped for pets. You can look down at a huge stretch of apparently untouched forest and realize that actually down there things are going wrong. Mammals are being disposed of for bush meat. The parrots are being trapped. Replanting is taking place sometimes with inappropriate species that don't interact very well with the rest of the ecological system, and so on and so forth. We have freshwater supplies. Scandinavia, perhaps not such a huge problem, but many places freshwater is a scarce resource. The ocean, the creatures that live in the ocean, many of which we try to eat, sometimes overeat, and so on and so forth. How can people manage to deal with so many different issues all at once? Migration of human beings from one country to another, from one continent to another, but also within a country, between rural areas and the cities, the rapid growth of cities, frequently inadequate facilities for dealing with the people who are crowding into those cities, hoping to make a living that they were unable to make in the country. And these issues are not only numerous, they're also interdependent. And we have this habit of, very natural habit, of dividing up the set of problems and looking at one category after another separately. So we have economic issues, we have political issues, we have environmental issues, we have cultural, artistic issues, and so on and so forth. We like to think of them as being in separate compartments, but actually they all interact strongly with one another. And that makes things even more complex and difficult to wrap our minds around.
Okay, well, thank you. Can I stop you there? Because we have this first sort of short intervention, and then hopefully coming back also.
Well, let me say one or two more sentences, if I may.
Okay, absolutely.
We need to develop a capacity for handling all these, for handling this multiplicity of issues and acknowledging that they are all heavily interdependent, which makes them even more difficult to analyze, but very important to analyze. We have to improve our capacity to deal with this kind of situation. It's not going to go away.
But then I will actually give you even two more sentences. How? How do we do that?
Well, I'll tell you.
That's what I like.
We change our point of view a little bit. There was a very brilliant French economist who had a high position in the World Bank, I think, and wanted to produce a set of booklets on the problems facing humanity, the whole of humanity. And he divided up the problems in this way that we've been discussing. Environmental issues, economic issues, and political issues, and so on and so forth. And in these 21 volumes that he thought of bringing out, there was not a single one that described how all of these things fit together. We must stop omitting that step.
Is he still working at the World Bank?
No.
Okay, good. I just wanted to check, make sure that, we are moving forward then. Thank you very much. I think these are really very important points and a challenge for science, of course, because you are, of course, also experts in your own areas. And the question is, do we have even a societal system in our education that teach us to think in that particular way? I mean, to integrate things. I would argue, unfortunately, still not too much. But oceans came up a lot. So, Professor Richardson, I would tend to agree. Oceans, 70% of this Earth's surface, providing all this food, all these services, carbon sinks, etc., etc., but still not very much in focus. What is the problem here? Why doesn't really politics listen to you?
Darn, I thought you were going to let me carry on from where Murray left off.
You can.
Because I think this is much more interesting.
You had the pleasure of ignoring my question.
Thank you. We scientists are trained, we are hired, we are promoted to be expert in detail and talk about what we're an absolute expert in. Thank you very much. But in fact, if you want to really communicate a problem and you want to, and I do think society is listening, I do think politicians are listening. I happen to think COP15 was a huge success, but we can go back to that. But if we're going to communicate it, we have to do it in headlines that we understand it. And yes, Murray, there are all of these different things and they all interact, but can we find a common headline for it? And I think in this case, the sustainability case, we can. Because your parrots, my ocean, all these things climate, all these things we're talking about relate to the fact that our species has been here for 10,000 generations, and we have been dependent on the natural resources on that planet, this planet, our planet, for all of that time. And we forget that dependency. And because the combined demand, and now we can use economic language because people feel happy and at home there, the demand for those resources when there weren't very many people was so small, we didn't have to worry about them being limited. Now we're 7 billion people, we're going to be 9, possibly 10 billion. And what science is telling us, and what we've been discussing at this meeting, is that all these different areas tell us that our demand is too big compared to the supply. So all of this is about getting supply and demand in line, and that's where the mindset change in our document comes out here, because most people, and I hear it when I talk to the media, I hear it when I talk to all of you, most people seem to think, yes, we've got growth over here, we've got economy over here, and then we've got environment over here. It's two completely different things. They're in opposition to each other, and some people don't think we can afford to actually worry about the environmental, the resource end of it. In fact, if we're talking supply and demand, and supply isn't there anymore, it's not a question of being able to afford. We can't have growth, and we need growth on this planet. Even though a lot of people don't like growth, there are so many people on this planet that need better welfare, need a better standard. So we need growth. And if we're going to have growth, the only way we can do it is by recognizing that those natural resources are our currency. They have always been our currency. None of us would use more money than absolutely necessary to buy a good or a service. Why are we using so many of our resources to get those goods and services?
But would you say that maybe the market economy will take care of everything? Because when it gets scarce resources, prices will go up and we find other things.
There are many tools in the market economy that can be used to help us get to sustainability. But the market economy works within a framework which is established by politicians, by society. And we need to change that framework in order to be able to use the many excellent tools there are in market economy. Because actually, you say, how do you get people to change? You get people to change by making them feel it in their own pocket or in their own heart, or it has to be close to them. And money is, unfortunately, very close to us. So why are we subsidizing fossil fuels instead of subsidizing renewable energies? Why is it that we're taxing in such a way that we are actually promoting the misuse of resources? Why is it that I live in Denmark, our farmers rode their tractors, God help us, into the middle of Copenhagen to demand their right to overuse nitrogen and phosphorus because everybody else has the right to do it. Our whole mindset about resource use has to change in order to be able to get on a sustainable path. And I think it's communicatable, and I think people and politicians are listening, but I'm kind of on Peter's line that we're not very good at communicating it in the understandable headlines. We're much better at focusing on the details. And I love the ocean.
Yes, that's fine. But thank you for not answering my question, because the questions that the answers that you provide are, much more interesting than my questions. But I gave you that mandate. You can disregard me completely if you want. Even you, Professor Steffen, can do so, of course. And you are next here. I mean, you have been working with climate change issues your entire career. You have clearly demonstrated the effects of climate change, the potential effects. And I think as early as Monday this week, obviously, you met with the Australian government also, which was, of course, then a direct interaction with politics. Can you maybe, if you feel like it, tell us a little bit about that experience and how did you get to that point?
Well, I think one of the interesting things on the climate change issue is the fact that it is now recognized, as Catherine has said, not an environmental issue here and an economic issue there, and maybe a social issue way out there if we have a bit of time we work on. It's now central, at least down in Australia, because we're a fossil fuel rich country, we're a fossil fuel exporter country, and yet at the same time, of all the developed countries of the world, we suffer the most impacts. Severe droughts, floods, bushfires, heat waves, and so on. So the extreme event story is now become quite compelling, particularly those that are related directly to temperature. So this has become central to how we deal with climate change. Now, I'm a member of a so-called multi-party climate change committee. Now, this is an attempt by our government to get a cross-party approach. It hasn't been entirely successful, but the government has put together a committee of 7 parliamentarians chaired by the Prime Minister. But interestingly, there are 4 of us who have been invited on as expert advisors, but full members of the committee, able to take part, argue, even vote on things. And it's interesting, I'll just name the 4 areas of endeavor that are on that committee, because it gives you an idea of how we're trying to approach this now. One is science, of course, and I'm very happy that that's on there because that comes up again and again, and when scientific questions come up, the parliamentarians will turn to me and say, well, what do you think about this? Is this rubbish or is this okay? The second one, of course, is economics. So we have to have that in there. But the other two are interesting because they're really the opposing sides, if you like. The third one is the industry sector, particularly the electricity generating sector. We generate over 80% of our electricity by coal-fired power stations. Big issue to get emissions down. But the fourth one I think is fascinating. This is social equity issues. And they have equal rights with economy, with science, and with industry. And so whenever now we discuss further down what economic instruments, what other accompanying instruments we want to get emissions down, how is that going to affect the lower income strata in Australia and so on. So I think what's happening now, at least what we're seeing in Australia, is that this has become a mainstream, one would argue the mainstream issue. We've had one leader of the opposition and one prime minister basically fall on the issue. So it's now central to how we go forward as a country. So I think there are some examples of how we take these ideas that Murray's talked about, that Catherine's talked about, and really where the rubber meets the road, which is getting legislation through Parliament, putting prices on things, doing other things to take subsidies away from where they shouldn't be and putting them on where they should be. We're actually now getting on to that nitty-gritty. It's a fascinating time for science to be there because, in fact, I think, indeed, they are listening to what science is saying.
Thank you. And scientists really have to be there to provide the different tools and knowledge, of course, in all these different aspects.
One of the fascinating things, of course, is when we sit around just as scientists, we think, well, everyone should just listen because we're the science and this is what should drive things. When you sit in a committee like that, you realize that, yes, science is being heard, but so are lots of other viewpoints from society. And it's this interplay which is absolutely fascinating experience for us.
And that's the role of politicians, of course,
absolutely,
to cope with that.
Tough job.
Tough job, definitely. And what is it a bit interesting what you're saying? I mean, I heard you, Professor Richardson, saying that, well, you don't see COP16 as a failure. I tend to actually partly agree with you, and we can have an interesting discussion about it during the coffee, I hope, because it might be different perspectives. But there were interesting parts of COP16 clearly coming out. But many would argue, of course, that the global negotiations are not moving on very, very well. What you are saying is, of course, giving an example of Australia, would you argue that, well, maybe the global negotiations aren't necessarily that important? It's really about taking action on the ground, in each country.
Yeah, let me just very quickly say, I think COP15 in Copenhagen was a far bigger success than most people think, for a couple of reasons. One is, over 100 world leaders got together.
Exactly.
I don't think they fully realized until they came face to face with the problem how complex it was and how it cut across things. That was their awakening. If this isn't an environmental problem out here, we can simply sign off on and solve. But the second thing, probably even more important, is it triggered lots of action at different levels. There's no doubt in my mind that the action in Australia, stop and start as it is, politically complex as it is, was partly an outcome of we didn't get to where we wanted to go in COP15, so let's get on with it in a different way. So in that way, I think it was a success. So
a failure at the global level can trigger success at the national, local level. That's how you see it when you are positive and optimistic about things. Which I think is, that's today. That's what we want today. Ms. Narayan, I saved you to last, and you were aware of that because I told you that beforehand. Because, of course, you are, by person, really a link between science and policy. You have really dedicated a lot of your career in trying to get politicians to listen to environmental issues, but also considering social aspects, equity, etc. I must mention that in the time, you were named the 10th most influential person in India.
Sort of, but
Sort of. Don't be shy. If you're the 10th most influential person in Sweden, who cares? 9 million people, whatever, We are talking about a country 120 times Sweden here. So, I mean, that's something different, I would argue. Can you give us a couple of your points on this challenge? Because you have really worked in that middle as a scientist going into politics.
No, I think, Johan, today has been fascinating also to listen to everyone and to see how clearly some things are very clear now. I mean, I think science is standing on one side telling us that we know that the risks are very high of not taking any action. From where I come from, the country I come from, it is very clear that we are beginning to see the impacts. And it is the poor of India, the people who have least contributed to climate change, they are the victims, in some senses, of our use of fossil fuel. They are seeing the impact. We are getting more rainfall. We are getting rainfall with lesser rainy days. And what science in my country is telling us that that's going to be one of the most evident, one of the reasons, one of the ways in which we will see the signs of climate change is that we will have more intense rainfall events. Now, I come from a country where the finance minister of my country is not the man who sits in the chair, but actually the monsoon. It's the rain of India, which is the finance minister. Now, when the rain of India, the monsoon of India, starts to get disrupted, just look at the impact. And look what it does to people. So I don't think we need to be preached to today that climate change is real. We don't need to be told that there is something that is going to happen and that the world needs to act. I think the question that I have, and the slight difference I have with my co-panelists, is that I certainly don't see action at the scale and pace that is needed today. I don't see the reinvention, even in our minds, of the need for society to transform itself. I see too much of glib words and glib governments talking about the fact that they will decarbonize and reduce their emissions when they're really doing creative carbon accounting. And I think that's where the big challenge for all of us sitting here is. Climate change is also about sharing the resources of this planet Earth. We know very clearly that our consumption pattern is not affordable. It is costing the Earth. We know, therefore, that we have to change our consumption, and we have at the same time the challenge of seeing growth in large parts of the world. So it's really that dual challenge of being able to share and being able to grow. And for that, I think what we really need is not just an efficiency revolution, but we need to be able to celebrate those limits to growth. We need a sufficiency revolution. And I believe, and as I talk about this in my own country, I don't think that people are worried about this. I think they need to know how do we move ahead, because people know that this is one planet Earth, and they know that we will have to find a way to live and to share its resources. So I think that's where the big challenge is. Stop the glib words from business and from countries saying, we're already doing it. We're not.
Thank you very much. So a sufficiency revolution. When you talk to the richer strata of the population in India, do they also buy into that?
Well, my biggest challenge in Delhi is to stop cars, okay? And the logic of it is very simple. 13% of Delhi today owns a car, 13%. 26% of my city, which is a rich city of India, so please don't get it wrong, is under roads. 13% drive, 26% of the city is under roads, but congestion is increasing, pollution is increasing. So the big challenge is, if all of Delhi needs to have mobility, then it's not about a car. So to me, the answer is that Delhi needs to reinvent mobility. We need a metro system, we need buses, we need bicycles, we need it all integrated. And the lesson and the message that I give in Delhi, which I'm sharing with all of you, is that we do that today. Most of Delhi takes a bus, most of Delhi bicycles, but because it is too poor. And the challenge is, can all of Delhi take a bus and bicycle when it is rich? And that's really, I think, that reinvention. You called it the mind shift. I see this as that mind shift.
Thank you very much for that. Excellent interventions, of course, always, that's my fault, only taking a little bit more time than expected. What we would like to do now is to bring you in, Anders, and give us a couple of the feelings going on in the room out here. You're such a nice and quiet audience. I wish my kids were like that. But give us some of the gist and what is going on. And then I would, and if you listen to that, I will give you 1 minute to respond, and then it's over. So please.
I think a minute is too little, because if we should answer all the questions, we have to meet up tomorrow again. But there's a lot of questions coming. It's not silent, as you might think. Can we reach sustainability while having an exponentially growing economy is one question.
Can you say it again a bit more?
Can we reach sustainability while having an exponentially growing economy?
Any quick reaction? Let's take exactly like that. A quick reaction on that. Can we reach sustainability?
We have to distinguish different kinds of growth. Growth in quantity, which is, of course, needed for the very poor, people who are lacking elementary necessities. But for the rest, one can, at a certain level of prosperity, substitute growth in quality for growth in quantity. Marvelous handmade artistic objects, for example. All sorts of things that do not place an unnecessary strain on the society or the environment. It's not absolutely necessary that we just keep consuming more and more and more and more as we grow more prosperous. Instead, we don't have to dispense with growth, but we can gradually transform the growth into growth in quality.
Thank you very much. I think that is a key point. A quality revolution, sufficient revolution, that's excellent. I at least feel things are breaking down very quickly. Can you pull in another question also?
Twitter is flowing as well. Here's another one. What is the main driver component to put the world on a sustainable path?
Okay, that is a very good question. What if there is a main driver to put us on the right track here? What is the main driver here? Anyone would like to?
Can I give a naughty answer?
Yes, a naughty answer first and then a scientific answer.
Let us all vote for the US president.
So we should all be citizens there, huh?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to change. The most powerful countries of the world have to change and show leadership. And I think, it's a naughty answer, but so forgive me, but I think we need to find ways to change the richest and the most powerful. And democracy is one way.
Excellent. Thank you, Sunita.
Yeah, very quickly, I think the symposium we've just had really came up with the headline issue here. We need to change a mindset. And that's a long-term goal, but we have to start today with small actions, but it all has to be consistent with a very different way of looking at how we live on this planet.
Change mindset, we hear that a lot. And that's probably the most tricky things. We can have laws and we can have whatever. That's easy, that's the easy part. Donella Meadows was the one really pushing that, changing the mindset of society is really high up on the ladder here somewhere. Very difficult. How do you change the mindset? Is it just through information or do you need a lot of combinations?
Well, I get different answers from different areas of social science that I talk to about that, but some people say you change mindset, you can do it first by changing laws. For example, smoking in pubs and restaurants. We've had a mindset change, but it started first by a legal change. In other cases, you change mindsets through communication, through ideas that spread quickly throughout society. Sometimes the word memes is used for that. And we're still doing some research on how those work. So I think there are multiple ways that you get a mindset change, but they all have to be moving in the same direction. That's the point.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Professor Molina.
Just a very brief point. Yes. A very important way to change this mindset in the long run is through education. We can certainly do a lot with children. The problem, though, is that we don't have that much time. So we should be able to educate our politicians as well, but that's a big challenge.
So we have to de-educate them first and then re-educate them, I think. Yes, that's right. So please, Anders, do you have another?
Yes, this one is from Twitter that you all can see. What single step would be the most efficient for cities to start with in order to be more sustainable?
What should cities start with in order to become more sustainable? I know, Sunita, you work a lot on cities and so on. But anyone else who wants to give? Yes, please.
I think we should take some of the wisdom from the native peoples. The United States, the Native Americans, the leadership, the elders would make decisions only when they considered the effects 7 generations in the future. 7 generations, that's our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren. And I think the leadership is very important. I think Mario hit on that quite correctly. And I think some perspective is here. Our lives are short, but the consequences are huge.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more, and then Professor Grünberg and Professor Richardson, I give you the chance to respond to this secret question. We don't know yet what it is, but we are approaching the end of the session. So please, can we have one more question?
Sure. This one a bit broader, I think. We need both technical solutions and change of lifestyles, but lifestyle change needs a new view on what is a good life. How can we reach that?
Okay, what is a good life? We probably have different views on that. Professor Grünberg?
I would like to contribute something to a question which was put before.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think was not sufficiently well answered. I think we can boost the economy, for example, by building the right devices. In Germany, we have a lot of these wind power stations and so, and there are other facilities which you can use in order to produce energy without any other problem. So I think that is also good for the economy and for boosting the economy. So this I wanted to add to this question.
Thank you. So technical innovation. Sunita, I will let you, because I would like to get your point on this sort of lifestyle issue as well, coming from a country growing very rapidly, where you have a chance maybe to shape, of course, also people's visions on that. But please, Professor Richardson, do you want to respond anything to that or any of the other questions, of course? I would like to give you a chance to do so.
No, I think actually that question has been pretty well covered before, in the sense that, yes, I think lifestyle changes are necessary, but that requires mindset changes, and Will was talking about how they can take place. But I think in terms of what's the most important thing cities or anyone else can do right now to get this started, because we have to both change proficiency, efficiency, mindset, defining what the good life is, that's a lot of things to do at once. Let's take the low-hanging fruits first, and in terms of cities, in terms of economy, in terms of many things, I think actually it's energy efficiency, it's fixing the buildings and so on, and I think that would have a lot of follow-on effects on these other issues. But I'm not saying that we don't need to redefine what a good life is, but I'm not going to sit back and wait till we figure out what it is before we get started. There are tons of things out there we can be doing today.
Thank you very much. That was extraordinary. Good also as a conclusion for the panel partly, but still, Sunita, I mean, we have a lot of options. That's what we like to hear.
I very much agree we don't have to wait. And I think the only thing is that I think we're also too much on the path where we are doing so much wrong. And I think for that, the lifestyle change issue must be central to what we talk about. And for me, there are only two issues there. One is that I think it's important for us to start measuring not wealth but well-being. And as we do that in our economies, and we have that in the memorandum, we have that in our discussions, and I think we need governments to start understanding and to start giving us that measure. Because as yet, most of our economies, all our economies are driven by the notion of GDP. And that's driven by the notion of consumption. So you cannot talk about reinventing growth when you have economies which are driven by the idea that the more we consume, the better it is for our country's growth. So I think we need to reinvent the very term GDP and bring it into a concept. The Bhutan government talked about a national happiness index. And the king was laughed at, saying, oh, you live in some fairy magic land. But I think perhaps we need to make Bhutan and that whole term part of our lexicon. We need to be able to measure well-being and not wealth. And I think as we do that, we will start understanding, and it's very important, because I say this in my country, I keep saying, we eat well, we eat organic, because we're largely people who eat at home and we eat local food. But we are looking at the lifestyle of the rich and famous across the world, and we say, oh, they eat hamburgers, they eat McDonald's, and that's how they measure being modern and good. So that's what we will start doing. We'll eat processed food, and then we will get fat, and then we will start dieting, and then we will have diabetes, and that's too much a rich man's disease. We can't afford it. So I think it's very important for us not to take that entire route and have, now when I come to Sweden, everybody talks about organic food. But that's because you've gone through that entire cycle of eating bad and now eating good. Okay? We don't need to do that. I think that's the big issue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and also for introducing, of course, we should have a happiness index. At least, you know, these have been very serious issues, but I feel that you have communicated a positive tone. We can do things. My happiness index is much higher than it was 45 minutes ago. I hope the same for the audience as well. I would like to ask all of you, thank you for the questions, and give a big and very warm applause to the panel.